Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jared Hutchinson, and I'm a product marketing manager at Regrow. I'm calling in from Lockhart, Texas, which is the Texas capital of barbecue. So this is a particularly relevant topic for me today. The reason we put this together with our partners at AgriWebb is because we've seen a ton of demand within the beef industry for planning, launching, quantifying programs to help reduce emissions within the supply chains. And so we're really excited about that demand. And what we learned working with some of the leaders in the industry is that there are the same questions and trends and hesitations that we had to help navigate for all of you. And so a lot of you are on the call today, and what we wanted to do is make sure we package all that wisdom up and all the lessons that we learned, all the goodness, and bring that to everyone else who's also trying to launch these programs and get these kicked off. So yeah, we're really excited about it. And what we learned is that there are generally three buckets and three trends that we see in terms of obstacles that people generally face in launching these programs. And that's how we're going to structure our conversation today. The first is going to be how to structure the right team for an emissions reduction program. Who's doing what, roles and responsibilities, what expertise you need on your team. You'll see that it's Regrow and AgriWebb today. We've partnered with a lot of folks in the industry to help deliver some of these programs. Second is going to be, once you have the right team, how do you actually design a program? And we are really passionate about designing a program for scalability here. If you've been in the industry, as long as we have, you've seen a lot of pilots just kind of sit in pilot stage and never scale. So we definitely want to talk about how do you maximize your ROI and how do you make sure that you're scaling and thinking about scale from day one. And then lastly, once you have the team, once you have the program design, you bring this to ranchers, of course, and how do you make sure that you're aligning everything with rancher needs, business goals, and you're communicating and engaging them in the most appropriate way possible to make sure that they stand to gain as much as everyone else that's part of the team. So as I go through, or we go through today, drop your questions in the Q&A. We'll try and answer them as much as possible at the end when we have some time for Q&A. But I will pass it to the presenters today, and we'll take it from there. Carol, you want to take the next slide? Do some intros.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. Excited to talk to you about this incredible opportunity to decarbonize in the agricultural sector. I'll first tell you a bit about Regrow. If you're not familiar, we're a science and technology company that works with organizations across the agriculture value chain, from large co-ops to global agribusinesses and leading consumer brands in food, feed, and fiber. We scale our science through our software platform, where we can deliver both rigorous and granular dynamic data that incorporates in geo-precise regenerative practice adoption to report more accurate Scope 3 emissions and identify abatement opportunities. And then we turn those opportunities into action through our category creating digital MRV for ag, where we monitor, measure, report, and verify the outcomes at a field or producer level to support farmers or ranchers in a sustainable transition that actively decarbonizes your supply chains. So those customers that are running Regen Ag MRV programs with us today have plans to impact more than 7.3 million acres with Regrow's tools. To date, the MRV programs that we support have abated nearly 800,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. And we've supported farmers to decarbonize on field with more than $27 million in incentive payments for implementing sustainable practices. So why am I here? I'm on our enterprise go-to-market team. I support our current and prospective customers to develop solutions that allow them to meet their sustainability goals in agriculture, which includes beef. My early career was leading commercialization in the food system. And I've been working in enterprise tech for the most recent phase of my career, really bringing my passion to life here at Regrow. I'll pass it to my partner, Elyssa, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Carol. My name is Elyssa McFarland, and I'm on the solutions engineering team at Regrow. And basically what that means is I get to work with all of the brilliant scientists and experts at Regrow, as well as those on our partner sides, and figure out how we pull together all the right puzzle pieces to create successful programs that make sense for ranchers, as well as are scalable, reportable, and rigorous. My background is in farm data management and soil science. I am based out of Southeast Iowa, where I farm with my family. We're primarily a row crop operation, but we do have a small cow-calf herd. And then we also finish everything that's born on our farm. And depending on market, sometimes we pick up some feeders. I will go ahead and turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Elyssa. Really excited to be here with you and Carol. And hi, everyone. I see a lot of friends here in the attendees list and some new faces as well. So thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Buckley Biggs. I lead sustainability for a livestock software company called AgriWebb. We are an Australian company originally, started about 10 years ago, now based in Australia, the US, the UK, and also Brazil, as well as 18 countries total. We really focus on cow-calf, backgrounding, and stocker operations, so producers who have grazing cattle, as well as those who have sheep and bison. So anyone and everyone thinking about how to improve management, how to get more out of their business, and increasingly how to be part of sustainability programs. We're thrilled to be partnered with Regrow on a number of projects and programs today in the beef supply chain here in the US, and excited to dig into the details of what's needed to make those programs successful and how can we best support producers.
Before we get into the kind of meat of the conversation, I realize I just made a pun. We wanted to know and just ask you all where you all are in the journey to launching a beef emissions reduction program. And you'll see a poll pop up, and would love to see where everyone is so that we can speak and cater our conversation accordingly. Leave it open just for a couple more seconds. Thank you all. All right, so looks like, I think those results should be up on your screen. Looks like there's a mixed bag, a wide variety. There are people just, no plans, just thinking about it. Some that are up and running a program, some that are still planning. So good to know. We'll be talking about, a lot of things that are relevant for all of you. But with that in mind, Carol, I will pass it back to you to set the stage and take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Jared. So why are we here today? So I'm sure everyone has read about calls to reduce beef consumption per capita, but what this strategy doesn't take into account is that with a growing population demanding high quality protein, overall beef production in the world is going to and must increase. And according to the World Resources Institute, that increase for global beef demand is going to grow by 88% by 2050. More beef will demand more land. Today, 60% of ag land is used in beef production. And the imperative here is that producing beef on land uses 25%, or produces more than 25% the greenhouse gas emissions of row crops. So the good news is in our beef supply chains is that we already know how to decarbonize beef production. So while beef production in the US has increased over the past 50 years, by learning how to make animals more efficient and maximize the amount of meat coming off the cow, we've actually reduced the greenhouse gas intensity of beef and the industry's emissions. And so at an animal level, the intensity of beef has decreased 34% through advances in breeding, for productivity, scientific feed formulations, better vet care to reduce death, a growth in grain-finished feedlot systems, and more. This translates at a macro industry level for total reductions, even with increased beef, to 21% in the US. So if we know how to do it, then why is there hesitancy? So it's due to the complexity in the how. So how do I structure a scalable program that will pass an audit? How do I collect the right data in a simple and rancher-friendly way? How do I communicate the program to ranchers to get them to participate? So overcoming this how involves three main processes. Enrolling ranchers is the first step. Collecting the right data from them is the second. And then running an MRV process to produce outcomes that you can ultimately claim towards your organization's goals to decarbonize beef. However, these middle two processes are what have traditionally been challenging. So collecting and quantifying the data has not been scalable in the past. So we've seen low rancher enrollment due to onerous data collection methods that weren't intuitive to their operation. We've seen poor data quality that made QA, QC, and recollecting data an expensive process to get to those results. And then unverified outcomes mean that we can't report the quantification towards our goals. So More good news is these complex steps have been digitized to reduce the burden for all stakeholders. That's what Regrow and AgriWebb are here to talk to you about today. It starts with ranchers and only collecting the right data required in a UI that's intuitive to their operations. This data is then passed to a digital MRV to quantify practice impact, and this is where the science comes in. And then those outcomes are sent to project developers to report on the progress of what they're taking action on. So I covered why and the what we need to overcome, but we'd like to hear from all of you. What are your biggest hurdles that you've seen so far? Jared's going to launch the poll again. I'll give you all a second to reply. It looks like a variety of different issues, data collection and lack of confidence in outcomes taking the lead. We're looking forward to digging in on your feedback in the Q&A. So let's get back to the how. I'm going to pass it to Elyssa, who's going to talk about what makes a beef emissions reduction program successful.
Thanks, Carol. So as we've just chatted about, there are some known kind of challenges to running a program. But in order to overcome those, we've kind of identified 3 ingredients based on our experiences working together. The first is structuring the right team. There are a lot of moving parts for these programs, and getting the right folks with the right expertise engaged is really important. The next of which is designing for scale. As Carol alluded to, we've got some big challenges and some big goals for what we want to try to achieve in terms of impact. And so we need to get better at moving past that pilot stage. How do we go from a handful of ranchers to hundreds or thousands of ranchers? And then lastly, optimizing that rancher engagement, because as I can tell you from working with my dad, you can't convince a rancher or a farmer to do something unless they see the value in it and it makes sense to them. So we're going to start off with structuring the right team. There are some kind of core competencies that you need to have covered in every program, and these don't necessarily all have to come from the same organizations, but these are the kind of key functions that need to make sure are met within a program. So as from the responses in the poll, scalable and trusted science is really a core foundation of these programs so that all partners engaged feel like they can trust the outcomes, they understand the kind of underlying value that's being driven through the supply chain. The data collection component, as Carol highlighted, is really important to make sure it's streamlined, that it's easy and efficient for producers. And then the last component is that technical assistance. So making sure that farmers understand the programs, that they get their questions answered. Business is based on relationships, and ag is no different. Having folks that are the boots on the ground who know the producers and can answer their questions is really important. And then lastly, that kind of middle circle says CPG. It could really be any partner that's funding the program and claiming the reductions and kind of tying all of these pieces together with their supply chain. This is kind of the theoretical description. We have a really awesome kind of description of how this has worked in practice, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So an example of this is a program that's currently running in Texas. It was launched last month. We're excited to be a partner on it with Regrow and a technical assistance provider called National Grazing Lands Coalition. I'm sure many people here are familiar with them. National Grazing Lands Coalition really leads this program and is the boots on the ground, engaging producers, reaching out to them to see if they're interested, vetting them to understand, is there an opportunity for achieving reductions on that specific operation, and does it make sense for their needs, what their family is looking to achieve for their business. This is a reductions focused program, so we kind of set soil carbon aside and looked at how can we reduce methane emissions and also nitrous oxide emissions from reduced or more targeted fertilizer use. You can see here that Purina Pet Care here has a pretty ambitious goal. This is working towards their 2030 target under the Science Based Targets Initiative. So we structure the entire program based on the number of tons, the 100,000 tons that they needed to be reduced by 2030. With an eye towards, well, how many cows does that mean? How many farmers, ranchers does that mean that would need to be part of the program? And then, how many farms or ranches could we realistically onboard each year to the program to give us a sense of what do we need to do next year to get to those 2030 targets. So we're really excited about this program, and there's a website listed there at the bottom if anyone wants to read more about it. And also, if you know any ranchers in Texas who are interested in sustainability opportunities, this is an exciting project, so we'd love for you to send them our way. And a really key piece here is we've tried to reduce the risk and the costs for the producers. So technical assistance is free for them, AgriWebb is free for them. There's a whole lot of support from the get-go, as well as outcomes-based payments for actual reductions achieved.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. Too bad that I'm too far north for that, huh? Wish I was in Texas. We're going to go ahead and talk, now that we've kind of got an idea of who needs to be involved in programs and what they should be doing. We can talk a little bit about how we design programs, and specifically with that idea of how we get to scale. So the first thing that we need to know when we're thinking about scale is where we can have the greatest impact for our time invested. And as we look across the beef production system, the cow-calf portion of production has the greatest emissions, and we have the greatest opportunity to impact those emissions at that stage. Now, one of the tricky things about the cow-calf stage is that we don't really have traceability back to the cow-calf stage. And so one of the things that's kind of been a important component of designing these programs is taking a supply shed approach. And what a supply shed approach means is that you don't have to have that actual traceability back, that this calf from this feedlot came through this backgrounding facility and from this cow-calf operation. You can just look at the region in which you're sourcing. So for this example in the map, it's 4 different states, and you can target your program engagement with cow-calf producers in those 4 states. The supply shed approach can also kind of unlock opportunities for partnerships. And again, I'm going to toss it back to Nick to talk about how that works.
Yeah, so especially in the U.S. Beef supply chain, where we have traceability challenges, there's still an opportunity for companies to invest at the cow-calf level, as Elyssa said. The critical piece is that you need to have granular data about the animals, about the pasture, about fertilizer use captured at that cow-calf level, so that we can understand the carbon intensity impacts of practice changes. But this then opens the door for some interesting co-financing opportunities. Here you see an example of a primary or a secondary processor who jointly funds a program with a retailer that they're supplying into. By doing this, both companies can co-claim the outcomes coming out of that program, because it's the same supply chain that they're working in. If you have one company that's sourcing byproducts for pet food and another that's sourcing steaks, in that case, they would be dividing the number of units coming off of that operation in half. So it would be co-financing, but not co-claiming opportunity. It's really where you have a supplier and a retailer or a CPG working together that you can significantly bring down the costs. And this matters because for most of the clients we're working with in the food and ag space, they think about costs in terms of dollars per ton, what's going to be their return on investment. And they're more able to get funding and support for a program if they can show a reduced cost dollars per ton because of this kind of a co-financing setup.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So now that we've talked about kind of the supply shed and those partnerships, what do we need to actually do to reduce emissions on ranches? One of the kind of most basic principles is around efficiency. So efficiency is a primary driver of emissions reductions. It's a fairly simple principle. The more days that calf is gaining weight on the farm, there's more days that they're emitting methane. And so if we can reduce the number of days that calf is needing to be fed and getting up to weight, then we can reduce the emissions from the production system. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of go about doing this, but kind of just generally here, you can see there's the baseline conditions. Maybe it's 22 months from the time the calves are born through when they make it to slaughter weight. If we can reduce the number of months, then we can reduce the methane emissions from the cattle. We go to the next slide. The added benefit of increasing efficiency to reduce emissions is that this is also beneficial for farmers. So let's say for a cow-calf producer, they typically sell their calves at 12 months. if we can reduce that by a month or two and sell them earlier, but at the same weight, we're able to reduce costs on the ranch and then also recognize that income on the farm a lot faster. So this has the added benefit of increasing rancher profitability, which also creates supply chain resiliency in a different way because your partners in the supply chain have more resilient businesses. Go to the next slide. Thanks. So the options for how we increase efficiency are pretty varied. And so there's a few different ways that we can do this. The first of which is looking at things that impact animal health. So a healthier animal is going to gain weight faster. We can also look back in the breeding stock and the herd management. And if we have better genetics, for example, that are leading to calves that gain weight faster, that's also another opportunity to increase productivity. So with these first two categories, we're really thinking about how we can increase the rate of gain of that calf. For the next two practices or practice categories, they're a little bit different. So obviously changing the diet of the calf can have an impact on methane emissions. And then if we look even further back in the supply chain, back to where the feed is grown, there are practices that we can implement on those crop production fields, which for those ranchers that are also growing their own feed could be an opportunity. And one of the most important things I want you to take out of that last slide is that you don't have to do all of these. The opportunities in beef are great because there's a whole variety of different practices that farmers can implement and they can do what makes sense on their farm. Some of these things may not make sense to implement on their ranch or their farm, and they can kind of pick and choose. This also leads to scalability of programs because they're simple. You don't have to have onerous, protocols and whatnot. They're really simple when you're looking at efficiency. And we'll go to the next slide where we're going to talk about a specific example of how this is implemented on a farm. So in this example, let's say the baseline conditions are that you've got some calves that are, or cows that maybe don't have the fastest growing genetics. Maybe you haven't culled them yet. Maybe it's because it's your mom's favorite cow or some other reason why you haven't culled those cows yet and brought in new genetics. Maybe you're doing kind of baseline animal health practices, but your vet's been talking to you about some new opportunities of things you could implement. And your average time right now is 12 months to sale. If maybe you hear about an awesome program, for example, is the one that Nick talked about, and you decide, I'm finally going to invest and I'm going to replace some of those cows with some improved genetics. I'm going to add in those advanced health protocols that my vet was recommending, and it results in a month or two faster sale of those animals for the same weight, then you've effectively reduced your emissions on farm by increasing efficiency. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk about how all these kind of individual practices and things that are happening on operations get aggregated up into a bigger picture.
Thanks, Lisa. So if Elyssa shared some examples of the practices that produce outcomes, how do these outcomes add up to decarbonize an individual organization's supply chain? Like Nick gave the example of the 100,000 tons for Purina. So this here is just a simple example of a 5-year plan to hit a goal. In this case, we're reducing emissions by 75,000 tons. What's going to get us there? There's 3 main considerations. The first one is that your science provider should be able to handle a holistic range of practice categories. So those categories that Elyssa shared previously, Regrow is able to handle a wide range of intervention categories, and we're also able to forecast abatement potential in practices to help organizations prioritize which practices will create the biggest impact in the long term for their given supply chain. So in this example, the roadmap to 75,000 tons has to go above and beyond just enteric reductions. And we've highlighted where it includes a plan to implement regenerative practices on the supplemental feed crops that are applicable to this specific supply chain. Say we do have traceability and we know the ranchers in these states are growing corn to feed in the winter, and we can claim the removals from soil carbon removals on these feed crops in addition to reductions from, say, nutrient management and the enteric reductions. And so when it comes to handling multiple categories, like Elyssa described, you want to be able to keep it simple. The next horizon here that I'm sure everyone has an interest in is removals and grazing. This is on the horizon. And so when talking about a science provider that can handle multiple practice categories, you want to work with a science provider that's demonstrating rigor to meet the evolving industry standards, and many of those are still in development. And so your science providers should show active R&D, which is the case for Regrow in the grazing space. So the second consideration for getting to scale and hitting your goals is that rather than offering every option to the ranch that we talked about, start with a narrow selection to focus your producers on. So your science provider should be able to explain how the practices are parameterized in their modeling so that the program stakeholders are aligned on what has to happen on the ranch, what data needs to be collected, and how that practice is going to align to reporting outcomes. The third consideration is to focus on rancher recruitment in the early years in a focused area. So while we know that beef supply chains are expansive, success is starting in an area where you can have that network effect. So in year one, we started with the most straightforward practices, and word of mouth and best practice sharing in this local context is what's going to allow us to expand to other producers and then into other states. So now I'll pass it to Nick to talk more about that expansion with ranchers.
Thanks, Carol. And I just wanted to address one question in the chat now that Audrey put, what kind of ranches are we typically engaging in these programs? I think it's worth highlighting that we're working with all kinds of ranchers. I think different companies can make a decision around whether they want to include a variety of ranch types or focus on one type. We often recommend working with some larger ones, some smaller ones, different geographies, both to mitigate risk, but also because it could be that some of the smaller operations have a larger reduction potential, right? They may not have yet adopted practices that some of those larger, potentially more professionally run operations have. And yet in the bigger ones, you can see more kind of a better ROI in some cases if they're able to implement an intervention at scale, large number of acres, large number of cattle. So it's kind of up to the company themselves, and also, interest in engaging historically underserved producers or smaller family farms. There could be other reasons besides ROI that a company chooses to engage. But we have producers on AgriWebb who have 15, 20 head of cattle, and those who have 600,000 animals. So it's really, a full gambit, and our priority is to provide tools for both those types of operations, where they may have different levels of complexity around reporting needs, managing employees, managing tasks. And in both cases, they need good digital tools. So on rancher engagement, I think this is a really critical piece because as I think Elyssa had mentioned, there's been a number of programs in the past that have been started that just haven't seen good traction with producers. And the question is why? Why aren't they coming to the table? And I think there's a couple of things to think about. And the key one that most producers are asking for is there needs to be something in it for them. They need to have financial risk offset in terms of the upfront investment and some financial incentive in place to help get them to the table. They do have a lot of opportunities now in the carbon offset market. Many producers have a carbon offset contract on their desk. So the decision they're making is, do I do that? Do I do carbon insetting or sustainability programs or something totally different? They're making a financial decision here that's really important for their operation. They also need good tools. It was interesting to see in the poll that the top thing that has been keeping companies from investing in beef sustainability programs is data collection issues. And we see that all the time. Producers have been using kind of pencil and paper notebooks historically to capture their data, or they have shoe boxes full of receipts in the hallway. I'm sure Elyssa is smiling. This is familiar. There just haven't been good tools on the market in the past to help producers track their data in real time in an easy way, especially if they have a number of employees, a number of ranches that are all under one umbrella. So this is where AgriWebb has really been focused in providing that type of tool to producers and programs. And then finally, technical assistance. I can't overstate this. Having an advisor, an agronomic advisor who can help the producer understand what makes sense for them. It's not going to be that all of the practices or interventions are a fit for their operation, but over time, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 that they want to try, and they can start with the first one. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit and go from there. So with that in mind, I just wanted to highlight what financial incentives mean and take a step back, because we often talk about carbon offsetting or insetting, but what does the what is the context that they sit in? There's actually a variety of ways we can support farmers and ranchers financially. And the first one, maybe the most traditional one, is government programs, farm bill programs that are doing cost sharing or financing, helping producers with fencing and water infrastructure and animal health interventions, also free technical assistance services. That's a critical type of support. Another one is the carbon offset market, but also biodiversity credits. So these are both in kind of the payments for ecosystem services space is the term that's often used. But then what we're talking about today is really price premiums of various sorts. It's either a premium product that's branded as more sustainable. Maybe customers know that it's more sustainable and they're willing to pay more for it. And that trickles back to the farmer, ideally with improved compensation. Or there's carbon insetting, where you don't have traceability, but we're still investing at the ranch level and we're paying for outcomes. We're paying for reductions every year that rancher has achieved. And then finally, it's worth highlighting the important role of banks and financial lenders, whether it's improved access to loans, improved financing rates, or kinds of new green loans that are more focused at a project level on helping producers finance interventions. So I'll give you two examples quickly here, the branded programs and carbon insetting. On the branded program side, if we just go to the next slide. Thank you. We do have a customer in the UK that's using this kind of a branded approach within the sustainability sector. ABP is one of the largest, or the largest meat processor in the EU, and they have a product called Game Changer Beef. It's advertised, it's right on the package, as a 25% lower carbon footprint beef product. This is a fully integrated supply chain. They do have traceability. And what they've done is they've provided AgriWebb for free to all of their producers, right from the breeder or the cow-calf level through to slaughter. They're capturing data at a granular level. And that carcass data, the slaughter data, is actually flowing back to the breeders so they can see how their animals performed. So it's a really interesting supply chain. They do require the producers to capture data. And not only do they get the benefit of tools and data insights on their operations, but they also have guaranteed pricing in this case. So you can imagine the fluctuations in the cattle market. They know from day one what they will be paid at the end of the season. So that's an example of a branded program. And then I'll just walk you through what an insetting program can look like. I know people quibble over whether insetting is the right term or if it's something else. What we're talking about here is an outcomes-based financial incentive. So paying producers per ton of CO2 equivalent reduced. Step one, as Elyssa said, is enrolling producers, reaching out to them through networks, through events, in person, and typically that's done by the technical assistance provider. They will contract and enroll the producers that are a good fit for the program. And typically these are not long-term, these are not 25-year contracts like in the soil carbon market space. They're usually shorter term. It can be even every year they renew their contract. The next step is then to onboard them to AgriWebb as a digital tool. We need to capture both what they're doing today and in real time as they're changing practices. We also need to know their historical data. We need to know typically 1 to 3 years of historical records for a baseline to be set on their operation. So the first thing we do is really focus on the historical data, getting the ranch's map digitized on AgriWebb so we know their exact pasture and field boundaries, and having them have their animals right in their AgriWebb account so we know their stocking rates, their livestock inventory, and which animals will be part of the program. Then finally, data permissioning is hugely important. The number one thing keeping producers from participating in carbon programs is concerns about data security and data privacy. So we take that very seriously. Producers using AgriWebb own their data, and they need to go in their AgriWebb account and give permission to share their data with a third party for that third party to be able to access it. So in this case, it's Regrow. The producer goes into their account and says, I want to share these data points with Regrow for the purposes of this project. And they fully control that process, and there's kind of transparency in it as well. So that's through our API services. The next step is engaging with a technical assistance provider. Some programs do have an upfront payment to producers just per head of cattle they enroll to kind of get them going and motivate them to sign up. But then consulting with the advisor, tracking the changes in practices on AgriWebb, and then sharing that data with Regrow, both for the baseline and for the ongoing MMRV. The final step, and this happens every year, is the quantification by Regrow of how many tons of CO2 equivalent were reduced based on the practices that specific producer implemented. And then typically there's a payment, a flat rate per ton of carbon reduced that the producer will receive. And usually it's the technical assistance provider that kind of brokers the payment to be made to the producer. So I hope that helps everyone understand sort of the producer's journey and what it's like for a rancher to walk through these programs. And I'll just sum up by revisiting what we started on as the key components of creating scalable programs. I think everybody knows we need to move away from small scale pilots and create solutions that both produce outcomes that companies need for their carbon inventories, for their reporting under SBTI, but that also makes sense for producers. That's flexible to producers, that's tailored towards their needs, and really supports them throughout the journey. So we're very excited to be partnered with Regrow and a number of technical assistance providers across the US. And I think there are similar opportunities in other countries as well to engage producers meaningfully in this climate journey. So excited to hear everyone's questions. I know we have quite a few in the chat, and I'll turn it back to Jared to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you all for presenting. That was super helpful. We got a ton of questions coming in as well, and we'll try to answer those accordingly. We do have some new folks as well on the Regrow side that are here to answer questions, so you may hear some new voices in the process. Let's see here. I'll do this first question from Audrey. The question is, does doing this affect animal welfare? Is animal welfare considered in any of your sustainability measures, expectations, programs, etc.? And I think, Kyle, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I think hi there, Audrey and everybody else. My name is Kyle Caston. I work as a customer success manager here at Regrow on a number of our livestock projects. What I would just say in general about accounting is there's a lot of unknowns in this space still. It's something that we're tracking as we continue to do more programs and engage with a lot of the certifying bodies. And so I don't want to speak too much on this because it could evolve quite a bit between now and the end of the year.
Great. And then
I'll just jump in on that one, Jared, too. I think the question is around, are we trying to impact animal welfare in these programs?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was looking at a different Audrey question. Yes, animal welfare is a critical component of all the projects that we work on. A healthy animal is an animal that's going to get to cell weight faster. And so that's a real effective way that a rancher can reduce their footprint is by having healthy animals. And so that is definitely a component that we're focusing on for all of our existing programs. Thanks, Nick, for the correction. I was looking at a different Audrey question.
No, it's a really interesting point. I was just down at the beef cattle short course, and it's interesting hearing how ranchers are thinking about improving their operations. It's often about animal welfare. I listened to a whole presentation on body condition scores and how can we make sure that animals are in good shape, and how do we monitor, how do we track records against that to improve our pasture management and make sure they have the forage they need. So that's really a win-win, right? They don't think about it in terms of carbon or climate. They're thinking about it as far as animal welfare, but that's a win-win. It's a win for the animal and for the producer, and then for the company that's trying to get these climate-related outcomes.
Thank you both, Nick and Kyle. Super helpful. I think, well, you may want to contribute, at least Kyle, to this next one as well. This question is from Ash Sweeting. Where do we see breeding for lower emitting livestock? Emission are heritable and genetic selection is a permanent change. Yeah, Kyle, did you want to contribute to that? I think Elyssa may, and maybe Chris as well, but Kyle, we can start with you.
Yeah, I can speak on this briefly, but we'll bring Chris in. So Ash, thank you for the question. Actually really appreciated some of your presentations at the Enteric Emissions Conference back in Davis. And so this was certainly on Chris and I's mind as we went into these projects. Our takeaway from that conference was that the impacts of genetics on emissions are still kind of an evolving space. And so while we track the emissions per individual, it's at this point, I think, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, relatively challenging to understand too much about the specific genetics of an individual and how that would be directly impacting the emissions associated with them. Of course, improved genetics in terms of, this animal is going to be more efficient at turning food into weight. Those are things that we do track because we would be able to track that animal's weight over the course of the project. But any direct impact on methanogenesis is something that currently I believe is tougher to track. And Chris, please feel free to chime in here and tell me everything I just said was wrong.
Hey everyone, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Chris George, manager of science applications at Regrow. Kyle's answer there was a good one. This is still a very new field. My job as manager of science applications is to really keep my eye on where the science is at and, what's coming and what's updated on that. So as more science comes out on this genetics and, these low emitting animals, we're going to keep reviewing and updating things to help see about when we feel comfortable incorporating all these impacts. We are incorporating impacts right now to Kyle's comment of, increased genetic potential for increased weight gain and things like that right now, but not on the lowered emissions directly at this point. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you both, Kyle and Chris. Let's see here. Okay, you might both be up again for this next one. Question from Carlos from Cargill. Do you need to use a mass balance approach to the carbon reduced capture? For instance, if you use only trimmings and tallow for pet food, and they represent 10% of live weight, you could claim only 10% of the reductions. I think Kyle or Chris, did either of you want to take this one? Or Nick as well. I think Nick, you may have been chiming in on this.
Yeah, I can kind of go back to my initial response. Apologies that I was mixing this up with the previous question. This is one of those areas where I think we're still investigating. We're open to hearing feedback from all reporting bodies on how this allocation would occur. And we've been exploring a number of opportunities with our current project. So Nick, if there's anything else you want to say, I'm happy to hear your thoughts and chime in.
Yeah, I'd just say allocations is perhaps one of the more complicated parts of the connecting these projects to companies' carbon inventories. I think Carlos and anyone else interested in this, we should have a discussion afterward, schedule a time to go into the details. There's there's various ways of tackling it, and also different groups, whether it's Sustain Cert or others, have developed various approaches. I think there are still a lot of things in the works, as Kyle said. So the question is, what can you invest in today that will be able to be claimable? But happy to chat about it more after.
Thanks, Nick. And Nick, I think this one you might be able to handle as well, and some of the other folks on the call. I think it's an interesting question related to the team that you build. It says, how can corporates differentiate between the many technical assistance providers in this industry for beef-related carbon insetting programs? I know we had NatGLC up there, but for the Purina project, but any of the folks, Nick, maybe if you wanted to start, is there anything particular that you'd call out about either NatGLC or your experience with technical assistance providers that you think, are super relevant for folks to know as they're vetting partners for their team?
I think it's a great question. I think local presence is critical, kind of an entity being based in a local community that you're trying to engage. You can't overstate the importance of trust and relationships in ranching communities. And if you can work with a technical assistance provider that has people in person on the ground in a community, that goes really far. We work with a number of technical assistance groups that we have found to be incredible partners. AgSpire, Understanding Ag, NatGLC, American Farmland Trust, and there's a number of groups out there. I think it's worth speaking to them also about how they would tackle technical assistance. What would be their approach? Are they thinking about one-on-ones, in-person events, webinars? How do they usually engage producers, and then see what makes sense in your region? And this is the same thing at a global level as well. We work with technical assistance providers in Australia, in the UK. Some are more focused on grazing management and rotational grazing. Others have a stronger focus on kind of animal health. or profitability. So it's worth digging into that. And I think we should all be creative also about what counts as technical assistance. I think there is a role for pharmaceutical companies, for kind of more traditional agronomic advisor groups to play a role here, especially as we have different types of new interventions coming on the market.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm calling you up one more time, Nick. I thought this is a very good question from Matea. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but what are you seeing as the biggest challenges with ranchers adopting digital tools and distributing financial incentives to ranchers? That sounds like right up AgriWebb's alley. So tagging you back in, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. I think the biggest challenge and opportunity with engaging producers in digital tools is helping them see how it benefits them. If you just send them a spreadsheet or a survey to fill out, it's the only thing for them is that it's the burden of them having to input their data, pull all these records together, and they don't get much back. I think the key thing is to make it so that data don't just sit there in a collected form, but are turned into insights for the producer. So that they have some charts to look at, even simple things like which of your animals is most productive, which breeder is getting you the healthiest animals, which interventions are getting you the best bang for your buck, or improving forage productivity or animal daily live weight gain. Those are the kinds of insights that when producers are sitting at the house after a day of work and they open up AgriWebb on their computer, they're looking at a version of AgriWebb that has lots of reports and insights and helps them to make business decisions. I think we need to start offering producers more of an upside to sharing their data than just a kind of an extractive exercise. So that's definitely where we've been focused, and it's a great question.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. And I'm going to tag in Chris on the science side from Regrow. A great question from Luis. Have any tests been carried out on nitrogen emissions, more specifically related to nitrogen fertilizer applied to pastures?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So at Regrow, we use the DNDC model, denitrification decomposition model. So this is a model we have approval through CARSEP, as well as through other protocols like BERA, BM42, where this DNDC model is running to quantify nitrous oxide as well as carbon outcomes on row croplands. So we have that for row crops as well as working on it with grasslands here. So lots of literature and the biogeochemical model here on DNDC that are being used to quantify nitrous oxide impacts and look at these fertilizer impacts in the fields. So thanks for that question.
Thanks, Chris. Let me see here, scrolling through. Chris, I might tag you in one more time. Another question here. How are you measuring the emissions from the cattle? Are you using an emission factor or using some sort of green feed bin to measure the methane emissions? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we are using an enteric model to quantify these enteric emissions. These enteric models are based off of the host of research studies out there. So a lot of them using green feed, SF6, other variety of methods. But yeah, an enteric model to quantify those emissions. So not live measurements out there in the fields, but using these enteric models to quantify the emissions here.
Thank you. Let's see here. We had a question from someone in Brazil. I'll just handle that one quickly. Is there any initiative in Brazil that uses these tools? I know from our standpoint, obviously Brazil with prevalence of ranching and beef within that country, it's something that we're obviously excited about. We do not have capabilities in Brazil yet. That is something that we're exploring for future projects and roadmap for us, but not quite there yet. But very excited about the potential there. Trying to see, scrolling through. Thank you for all these questions. Let's see. I'd say we can take another one here, which is one that we hear a lot about at Regrow. So I'll pass this to someone on the Regrow team, but from Carlos, we are seeing large food companies be prosecuted for greenwashing. And at the same time, we hear that the accounting is not yet largely defined or accepted. So how to move forward without a high risk of losing credibility, but also not stalling on progress. Carlos, that's a great question. I have an answer in mind myself, but anyone on the Regrow side want to take that one? If not, I can jump in here.
I might just speak kind of from my role on the solutions team, where we are pulling in all these various partners and identifying where the risks are amongst the different participants in the program. And one of the groups that I work very closely with within Regrow is our policy and protocol team, and figuring out what are the questions, what are the gray areas, and then working proactively with all of our partners to understand what everybody views as the risks about those gray areas and how we mitigate them together. And certainly, this is a very rapidly evolving space. And a lot of what we do at Regrow in terms of how we build our solutions is to build for scale so that we can flexibly change as we need to. So we've seen this on the row crop side, where we, delivered initial solutions and initial programs, and then the industry changed. There was new protocol guidance, gray areas got filled in, and we started to understand more about that process. And we could tweak our system to be able to meet the kind of new understanding of what those processes and protocols are over time. And so being able to adapt quickly and apply those learnings at scale and not having to kind of go back and do a bunch of manual work is a really key component about it as well. So that's maybe a little bit on the technical side from my role, pulling together partners and thinking about how we scale, but very curious to hear how other people are thinking about it.
I'll jump on to where Elyssa left off and stuff too. And, from the science perspective, it is really working with those protocols. They are, the ones really pushing the standards and the highest level of rigor on that. We love working with them, and it's an iterative process too, that we're going to continue updating with the protocols in terms of making sure we have the most, rigorous science, the most rigorous protocols, methodologies behind it. We run uncertainty modeling and on our models, especially on row crops right now, to make sure that we have that quantification done to the best level of certainty that we have with underlying data right now. So it's really working, with protocols, with partners, with the data and the model validation reports to make sure that we have that highest level of rigor to it.
I might just jump in here as well, Jared, on a couple of points. And I think the key one is around soil carbon. I think that's where most of the unknowns are in the grazing space, and especially around claimable outcomes. The draft Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector Removals Guidance requires traceability to the level of the supply chain that a company's investing in if they're going to claim soil carbon outcomes. That's not true for reductions, so methane reductions or nitrous oxide. And so that gives us a window today, I think, as a beef sustainability industry, as a community, to start to work on those enteric reductions that are possible while we see where the draft land sector removals guidance lands. Even though there's a huge opportunity around soil carbon and grazing lands, there's most of the emissions from the cow-calf sector are still on the enteric side, and we do have opportunities to reduce the emissions there. So I think that's a kind of risk mitigation strategy that companies can take today, even while investing in soil carbon outcomes, knowing that that's potentially where there's a higher risk around claims.
I'll just layer on one additional point. Like in the second scalability consideration that we talked about of defining your practices, working with your partners and your science partner to be able to explain how you got to those outcomes, how did you parameterize for what you're reporting on, and having that transparency is another way to mitigate the risk and be able to back up what you're claiming.
That was a great question to end on. Yeah, all those things, incredibly important, especially in an evolving and a nascent industry like this. Definitely work with folks that have, helped move the industry forward and are experienced in navigating some of the uncertainty there. So that will be our last question. I think I went over a little bit trying to answer everyone's questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours, but this will be recorded and shared out. And as always, if you have more questions, please reach out to us at Regrow and AgriWebb. We're happy to have more conversations and help, generate more momentum around this. Super excited about all the demands and all the interest we're seeing in this. And we hope that this webinar removes some of those questions and hesitations that some folks have in the industry. And we look forward to, seeing more of these programs launched and kicked off. So with that, goodbye, thank you, and we'll chat soon. Hopefully see you soon. Bye.